In 1947, Chicago police believed the most dangerous era of organized crime had ended with Al Capone. They were wrong. Because while Capone was loud, his successor was invisible. For nearly 50 years, one man controlled Chicago's underworld without ever officially holding the throne. Never indicted, never imprisoned, and rarely photographed. His name barely appeared in headlines, but judges feared him, politicians obeyed him, and the FBI watched his house 24 hours a day for decades. This is the story of Tony Accardo, the man who proved that in America's underworld, the quietest voice often commands the most power.
Tony Accardo was born Antonio Joseph Accardo on April 28, 1906, in Chicago's Near West Side, a neighborhood shaped by poverty, immigrant tension, and political corruption. His parents were Italian immigrants who worked tirelessly, yet the streets offered young Tony something the factories never could: respect through force. By his early teens, Accardo dropped out of school and gravitated toward neighborhood gangs tied to the Tony Capone organization. This wasn't recklessness, it was calculation. Even as a teenager, Accardo understood something others didn't. Survival wasn't about bravado, it was about alignment. He learned early to listen more than he spoke, to watch who really made decisions, and to stay invisible when violence drew attention. These instincts separated him from the countless street toughs who would later vanish into prison cells or unmarked graves. Chicago didn't just raise Tony Accardo, it trained him.
By the mid-1920s, Al Capone ruled Chicago's headlines. But power doesn't always live where the spotlight shines. Accardo joined Capone's inner enforcement circle under Johnny Torrio, where discipline mattered more than reputation. It was here Accardo earned the nickname Joe Batters, a reference to his role in brutal enforcement operations. But unlike others who reveled in violence, Accardo treated it as a tool, not an identity. Capone trusted him not because he was flashy, but because he was controlled. While others drank, talked, and postured, Accardo stayed sober, silent, and strategic. When Capone went to prison in 1931, most believed the outfit would fracture. Instead, something unexpected happened. The chaos exposed a truth Chicago insiders already knew. Capone was the face, but the future belonged to men like Accardo, who understood how to rule without being seen.
After Capone's fall, Accardo made the most important decision of his life. He stepped back. While other bosses fought for visibility, Accardo mastered insulation. He avoided wiretaps by never speaking directly. He delegated violence so thoroughly that even his own soldiers often didn't know who led them. Law enforcement knew his name, but they couldn't place him at crime scenes. He lived modestly, paid his taxes, invested in legitimate businesses. And when federal agents parked outside his River Forest home day and night, Accardo didn't flinch. He understood surveillance wasn't a threat, it was confirmation of success. By the late 1940s, Accardo had achieved something unprecedented: total control without exposure. The question wasn't who ran Chicago anymore. It was how long he could keep it that way.
To understand Tony Accardo, you have to forget everything Hollywood taught you about the Mafia. This isn't a story about flashy suits, public power plays, or endless gunfire. This is the story of control. In this Mafia Legends series, we focus on the men who didn't chase attention, because attention gets you killed. And no one embodied that philosophy more completely than Tony Accardo. While New York fractured into competing families, Chicago remained unified. That wasn't luck, it was design. Accardo believed the greatest threat to power wasn't law enforcement, it was ego. So as we move forward, remember this. Every decision Accardo made was about reducing exposure, limiting noise, and outlasting enemies. He didn't rise by being the strongest man in the room. He rose by ensuring no one ever realized which room he was in.
Those who met Tony Accardo often walked away confused. He wasn't intimidating in the traditional sense. He spoke softly, he dressed conservatively, he listened far more than he talked. But beneath that calm exterior was a man with a near-perfect memory, an instinct for leverage, and an unshakable sense of discipline. Accardo didn't drink heavily. He avoided loose company. He despised unnecessary risk. Former law enforcement officials later admitted their frustration wasn't fear, it was uncertainty. Accardo rarely issued direct orders. Instead, he shaped outcomes by positioning the right people, controlling money flows, and letting others believe decisions were their own. In a world where most mob bosses ruled through fear, Accardo ruled through structure. And structure, as he understood, was harder to dismantle than any individual leader.
Chicago in the early 20th century was a city of boundaries, ethnic, economic, and territorial. Neighborhoods weren't just places to live, they were lines of control. Accardo grew up watching how power flowed through unions, local politicians, and street crews. He saw how violence attracted attention and how silence avoided it. Unlike many of his peers, Accardo didn't romanticize the street life. He treated it like a system to be studied. He learned which corners mattered, which men talked too much, and which businesses quietly moved money. By the time he entered the outfit's ranks, Accardo already understood something most never grasped. Chicago wasn't ruled by gangsters, it was ruled by relationships. And relationships, when managed correctly, could last longer than any reign of terror.
For Tony Accardo, the choice wasn't between crime and honesty. It was between power and irrelevance. Legitimate paths offered stability, but no influence. The outfit offered both, if navigated correctly. Accardo didn't join to become famous. He joined to become indispensable. He aligned himself with men who valued discretion, learned the mechanics of rackets before touching profits, and avoided the fatal mistake of confusing emotion with strategy. This wasn't rebellion. It was career planning in a criminal economy that rewarded patience and punished impulse. Accardo understood that the streets were temporary, but infrastructure was permanent. And by the time others were chasing quick money, Accardo was already thinking decades ahead, building a future where he wouldn't need to be seen at all.
The nickname Joe Batters followed Tony Accardo for the rest of his life, but it misunderstood him. Yes, the name came from Accardo's early role as an enforcer in the Capone organization during the late 1920s. But what set him apart wasn't aggression, it was control. Accardo didn't lose himself in violence. He applied it selectively, surgically, and without emotion. That distinction mattered. Unlike men who chased fear to inflate their reputation, Accardo used force only to stabilize operations. Once order was restored, he disappeared again. Insiders later noted that the nickname embarrassed him. It drew attention, something Accardo despised. To him, violence was a temporary corrective, not a lifestyle. And once he realized brute force attracted law enforcement, Accardo began planning his exit from the streets, long before anyone realized he was doing it.
Under Al Capone, loyalty was currency, and Accardo paid in full. But while others sought Capone's approval through visibility, Accardo earned trust through results without noise. He handled logistics, enforcement coordination, and sensitive matters that required discretion. Capone noticed. Torrio noticed. By the early 1930s, Accardo was no longer just muscle, he was infrastructure. When Capone went to prison in 1931, Accardo didn't scramble for power,
He waited. That patience placed him exactly where he needed to be when the outfit reorganized under Paul Ricca. Accardo became Ricca's most trusted lieutenant, not because he demanded authority, but because he never overstepped it. In Chicago, ambition got you killed. Restraint made you indispensable.
By the late 1930s, Accardo made a decision that defined his legacy. He reduced violence, not out of mercy, but efficiency. Every public act of brutality brought investigations. Every investigation threatened continuity. Instead, Accardo focused on money flow, unions, vending machines, casinos, trucking, and political protection. Problems were solved quietly, often without anyone realizing a problem had existed. Those who crossed the outfit were usually neutralized through isolation, cut off from work, credit, or protection. Violence became a last resort, not a message. This approach confused rivals and frustrated law enforcement. Accardo wasn't fighting wars. He was removing incentives for conflict. And in doing so, he was quietly rewriting the rules of American organized crime.
In 1947, Tony Accardo officially became boss of the Chicago outfit, but almost no one noticed. There was no announcement, no bloodshed, no internal war. Paul Ricca stepped back, and Accardo stepped in seamlessly. That transition alone tells the story. While other crime families tore themselves apart over succession, Chicago remained unified. Accardo kept Ricca close as an advisor, ensuring continuity and loyalty at the top. Street crews continued operating independently, often unaware of who truly held authority. This separation insulated leadership and made prosecution nearly impossible. Accardo had achieved what every mob boss wanted, but few managed: absolute control without exposure. And now, with Chicago secured, his attention turned west.
When Tony Accardo looked west, he didn't see neon. He saw leverage. In the late 1940s, Las Vegas was still a desert town, loosely regulated, politically malleable, and desperate for capital. To Accardo, it was the perfect laboratory. The Chicago outfit quietly financed casino construction through Teamsters-linked loans, placing trusted figures behind the scenes while keeping Chicago leadership insulated. Accardo never relocated. He never put his name on anything. Money flowed through frontmen, skimmed off the top before profits were reported, then laundered back through legitimate businesses. Unlike New York families who fought over territory, Chicago treated Las Vegas like a subsidiary. This wasn't expansion through conquest, it was expansion through systems. And by the time federal authorities realized what was happening, the money had already moved. By the 1950s, Accardo had transformed the Chicago outfit into something unprecedented: a corporate structure. Street crews operated independently, reducing exposure. Leadership remained distant, unreachable, and deliberately ambiguous. Accardo emphasized cash flow, redundancy, and succession planning, the same principles used by legitimate corporations. He discouraged extravagance, avoided public disputes, and demanded discipline. Profits mattered more than pride. Even law enforcement struggled to map the hierarchy. There were bosses, but no obvious command chain. This design wasn't accidental. It was defensive architecture. If one part failed, the rest survived. Accardo wasn't running a gang. He was running an organization built to outlast him. Most crime bosses rule until they're removed. Accardo planned for after. Rather than clinging to the top position, he stepped back into the role of consigliere, advisor, stabilizer, and final authority when needed. This move confused outsiders, but reinforced internal loyalty. Younger leaders took public responsibility, while Accardo retained influence without visibility. It was the ultimate shield. As law enforcement struck, they hit replaceable figures. Accardo remained untouched.
This wasn't weakness, it was foresight. By decentralizing leadership while centralizing trust, Accardo ensured the outfit could survive generational change. Power to him wasn't about command, it was about continuity.
Accardo understood something many underestimated. Politics was the most valuable racket of all. Through unions, campaign donations, and quiet negotiations, the outfit influenced local officials, judges, and business regulators. This wasn't corruption through intimidation, it was mutual convenience. Contracts were steered, investigations slowed, zoning issues disappeared. Accardo rarely met politicians directly. Intermediaries handled everything, creating layers of plausible deniability. By embedding the outfit into Chicago's civic machinery, Accardo made removal costly, not just for criminals, but for institutions. This wasn't about control through fear, it was control through dependence. And by the 1960s, Chicago's underworld and its politics were so intertwined that separating them became nearly impossible.
By the 1960s, Tony Accardo had achieved something almost mythological. He vanished without disappearing. He held no official title, gave no public orders, rarely appeared at meetings, yet every major decision still passed through him. The outfit's leadership council, men respected, feared, and insulated, continued to consult Accardo quietly. His role was no longer operational, it was decisive. Street crews often didn't know who ultimately ruled them, and that confusion was intentional. It created distance. Distance created safety. When disputes arose, Accardo didn't intervene loudly. He waited, let tensions expose weakness. Then a solution appeared, often without his name ever being mentioned. This was power refined to its purest form. Not command, gravity.
For decades, federal agents parked outside Tony Accardo's River Forest home, sometimes openly, sometimes covertly. They followed him to restaurants, on vacations, even fishing trips. But surveillance isn't evidence, and Accardo knew the law as well as his enemies. He spoke carefully, met selectively, used intermediaries for everything. In 1978, when burglars targeted his home while he was away, the response was swift and instructive. Word spread quietly. The incident was never repeated. Accardo understood that restraint didn't mean weakness, it meant precision. The FBI waited for mistakes that never came, and as years passed, a realization set in. Tony Accardo wasn't just avoiding prosecution, he was outlasting the system built to stop him.
Tony Accardo died on May 22, 1992, at the age of 86. No prison record, no public confession, no dramatic downfall. He passed away quietly, surrounded by family, in a world where most men who chose his path never lived long enough to grow old. His legacy wasn't built on fear alone, but on discipline, patience, and silence. Accardo proved that power doesn't need recognition, and that longevity often matters more than dominance. In the end, his greatest weapon wasn't violence, it was restraint. A fish that keeps its mouth closed never gets caught. And Tony Accardo kept his closed for half a century.
After Accardo's death in 1992, the Chicago outfit didn't collapse, but something irreplaceable was gone. Leadership continued. Rackets survived, but the discipline faded. Accardo wasn't just a boss, he was a standard. He enforced restraint, punished excess, and demanded silence in a world addicted to noise. Without him, decisions became louder, greed became visible. Law enforcement noticed the difference. For decades, the outfit functioned without drawing national attention. After Accardo, investigations accelerated, prosecutions increased, and insulation weakened. His true genius wasn't how he ruled, but how he contained others. And once that containment disappeared,
the organization slowly began to reveal itself. Some men can be succeeded, others define the limits of success itself.
Tony Accardo's story is often misunderstood. He wasn't a folk hero, he wasn't a celebrity gangster, and he wasn't invincible. The Chicago outfit under Accardo was violent, sometimes brutally so, but that violence was managed, not celebrated. This distinction matters. Accardo didn't survive because he was luckier than others. He survived because he removed himself from the chaos that destroyed them. He avoided ego, limited exposure, planned succession. The myth suggests power comes from dominance. The reality Accardo demonstrated was simpler and colder. Power lasts when it stays unseen. Understanding that difference is the key to understanding why he lived and why so many others didn't.
Decades later, Tony Accardo's influence still echoes through organized crime history. He proved that centralized control didn't require visibility, and that organizations could be designed to survive leadership changes. Law enforcement analysts still study the Chicago outfit because its structure defied traditional investigative models. Even legitimate institutions unknowingly adopted principles Accardo mastered: decentralization, plausible deniability, and operational insulation. His life raises uncomfortable questions about power, governance, and accountability in American systems, criminal or otherwise. Accardo didn't just adapt to America, he understood it. And that understanding made him one of the most consequential and least understood figures in modern crime history.
Tony Accardo once said, "A fish that keeps its mouth closed never gets caught." It wasn't just advice, it was a philosophy. In a world built on noise, he chose silence. In a life defined by risk, he chose discipline. And while nearly everyone around him fell to prison, betrayal, or violence, Accardo walked a different path, one that ended quietly, not tragically. This story isn't about celebrating crime. It's about understanding how power truly works, and how the most dangerous figures are often the least visible. Because in the end, Tony Accardo didn't conquer Chicago. He outlasted it.